Clink. The bronze coin hit the mahogany desk, spinning like a dying heart. "You're done," Jimmy Hawk growled. The sound of his leather boots was a hammer nail. "My company doesn't pay for naps. Get out." Rita didn't move. She couldn't. Her brain was a jagged mess of raw code and 48 hours of sleep deprivation static. Her mahogany skin looked like ash. Her eyes were red raw craters. She just saved his entire empire in the dark, and he was stepping on her neck for the light of day. "Pack it," Jimmy barked, his Kentucky-bred stoicism hardening into a weapon. "Now!" Rita's fingers stayed frozen on the keys. A red alert flashed on her monitor. Then 10, then 100. The ghost thread she'd been strangling for 2 days just broke loose. She tried to speak, to warn him that the building was about to become a tomb, but her throat was sandpaper and salt. Before you watch him walk away, realize this. Jimmy Hawk thinks he just fired a tired girl. He doesn't know he just evicted the only person keeping the walls from screaming. Drop your city in the comments. How would you react if your greatest sacrifice was met with a pink slip? Don't move. This isn't a layoff. It's a countdown. Friday night started with a single anomalous ping, a digital whisper that shouldn't have existed. While the rest of the office toasted to the weekend, Rita Marcus saw the first flicker of the ghost thread. It wasn't a standard hack. It was a surgical strike designed to bleed the company dry. By midnight, the air conditioning had hummed into silence, leaving her alone in the sweltering dark of the server room. Every time she patched a hole, 3 more tore open. The hackers were relentless, a hydra-headed monster trying to liquidate every asset in the fintech core. Saturday became a blur of blue light and caffeine tremors. Her eyes felt like they were filled with crushed glass, but she couldn't blink. If she did, millions would vanish. She watched the clock hit the 30-hour mark, her mahogany skin slick with cold sweat, her fingers dancing across the mechanical keys in a rhythmic, desperate war dance. She wasn't just coding, she was wrestling. She rerouted traffic through dummy servers, built localized firewalls from scratch, and manually blocked 10,000 IP addresses as they hammered the perimeter. By Sunday evening, the delirium set in. The code on the screen started to look like moving shadows. Her frizzy braids felt heavy, pulling at her scalp, but she stayed locked in. She was the only person in the world who knew that a digital apocalypse was 5 minutes away, every 5 minutes for 2 days straight. She strangled the final exploit at 4:00 a.m. Monday, collapsing onto her keyboard as the sun touched the glass. She had won the war, only to wake up to the sound of Jimmy's boots. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the exhaustion. Rita stood up, her movements mechanical and stiff, ignoring the burning stares of her colleagues. Jimmy Hawk didn't even look back. He was already barking orders into his gold-trimmed phone, his boots clicking a victory march toward the executive elevator. Rita grabbed her bag, her fingers brushing the cold metal of her personal encrypted drive. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She walked toward the glass doors, each step feeling like she was wading through deep water. The silence of the office was deafening, a vacuum created by her sudden absence. She cleared the lobby, the humid air of the street hitting her like a physical blow. But the moment the revolving doors stopped spinning, the vibration started. It wasn't a call. It was the silent peripheral tucked in her pocket, the fail-safe she'd hardwired into the core. It began to scream. Not with sound, but with violent, rhythmic pulses against her thigh. She pulled out the device, her bloodshot eyes widening at the scrolling crimson text. The ghost thread hadn't been killed. It had been hibernating. The notification was clear. Admin override, protocol vein initiated. Her breath hitched. By firing her and deactivating her primary credentials, Jimmy had inadvertently tripped the final security latch she'd been holding shut with her manual overrides. The system was no longer just being hacked, it was being inverted. The building's smart grid was turning inward, locking every digital and physical exit. Rita looked back at the towering glass spire. The trap was springing, and the man who just spat on her was leading his team straight into the kill zone. The transition was instantaneous. Inside the lobby, the rhythmic hum of the building suddenly flatlined into a high-pitched, digital shriek. Massive steel shutters slammed down over the glass exits with the force of a guillotine, sealing the world out and the victims in. Rita watched through the narrowing gap as the skyscraper's exterior lights bled from corporate blue to a predatory, poolsing red. The smart building had just lost its mind. Up on the 40th floor, the executive elevators didn't just stop, they seized. The magnetic brakes clamped shut, stranding Jimmy Hawk and his board in a metal coffin suspended over a 300-foot drop. Panicked shouts erupted, muffled by the reinforced glass that was now an unbreakable barrier. Rita pressed her hand against the cold surface, feeling the building's vibrations shift. It wasn't just the doors. The haptic feedback on her phone confirmed the worst. Protocol Vane had hijacked the environmental controls. The industrial fans groaned to a halt, and the vents hissed as the dampers sealed shut. The oxygen scrubbers were being throttled, and the CO2 levels began a steady, lethal climb. In the boardroom, Jimmy hammered his fist against the smart glass, his face turning a panicked shade of crimson that matched the emergency lights. He looked down at the street, a small, helpless figure in a charcoal suit, realizing his fortress was now a vacuum-sealed tomb. The air was thinning, turning heavy and metallic. Rita's bloodshot eyes scanned the perimeter, her mind racing through the schematics she had memorized during her 48-hour vigil. She was the only person with the map to this maze, and the clock was already at 0. Suddenly, every monitor in the building flickered, replacing the red alert icons with a single high-definition feed. A man sat in a shadow-drenched high-back chair, his face obscured by a mask of digital static. This was Vane. His voice didn't just play through the speakers, it vibrated through the floorboards, cold and distorted. "Look at you, Jimmy," Vane purred, his tone dripping with a decade of fermented resentment. "The great pioneer, trapped in a cage of his own ego. You always bragged that this fortress was unbreakable, but you forgot that a fortress is only as strong as the people you betray to build it." On the boardroom's massive 60-inch display, Vane leaned forward, the static on his mask pulsing with every syllable. Jimmy Hawk stood paralyzed, his hands trembling as he stared at the screen. Vane began scrolling through a live feed of the company's offshore accounts, the balances plummeting towards 0 in real time. "This isn't just a heist, Jimmy. It's an eviction. You've spent years breathing the air of a legacy you stole, so I thought it was only fair to take that air away." The mockery was surgical. Vane played back a clip of Jimmy's earlier termination speech to Rita, looping the sound of the bronze coin hitting the desk over and over. It was the ultimate psychological checkmate. Vane knew about the firing. He had waited for the exact moment the company's only shield was cast out to pull the trigger. The board members gasped for thinning air, looking at their CEO with newfound terror. Vane was no ghost. He was a reckoning, and he was laughing as the lights dimmed. Rita didn't waste a heartbeat on the sidewalk. While the crowd outside stared at the bleeding red lights of the skyscraper, she sprinted toward the service alley. She knew the blueprints better than the architects. She knew that the smart grid had a physical blind spot in the subbasement. She reached a heavy, rusted delivery hatch and yanked a concealed manual lever she'd greased months ago for an emergency just like this. The metal groaned, protesting as she slipped into the dark, damp throat of the building. The air down here was thick with the smell of wet concrete and old electricity, but it was still breathable. Her boots slapped against the flooded floor as she reached the maintenance terminal, a relic of the old infrastructure Jimmy Hawk had been too cheap to upgrade. This was the back door. Her bloodshot eyes narrowed, reflecting the amber glow of a CRT monitor that hummed to life under her touch. Her fingers, still stiff from the weekend's marathon, flew across the keys with a frantic, desperate precision. She wasn't just logging in, she was breaking into her own house. "Don't you die on me now," she hissed, bypassing a dozen biometric locks that Vane had slammed shut. The terminal was slow, clunky, and ancient, but it was hardwired directly into the building's nervous system, bypassing the cloud-based hijacking. She watched the scrolling lines of green code, searching for the environmental override. Every second she spent navigating the archaic directory was a second of oxygen lost for the people 40 stories above. She found the core, a jagged, pulsing line of malicious code, and began to weave her own digital weapon to counter it. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere had thickened into a soup of carbon dioxide and panic. The sleek, reinforced glass walls were no longer a sign of prestige. They were the transparent panels of a gas chamber. Jimmy Hawk tugged at his silk tie, the knot suddenly feeling like a hangman's noose against his throat. His chest heaved, pulling in thin, metallic air that provided no relief. Around the table, the high-powered executives, men and women who spent their lives commanding markets, were slumped over like discarded ragdolls. One director slid from his chair, his forehead hitting the mahogany table with a dull thud that no one had the energy to react to. Jimmy's legendary Kentucky stoicism finally shattered. The wide-stanced arrogance was gone, replaced by a frantic, animalistic trembling. He lurched toward the door, his polished leather boots dragging heavily across the carpet. He hammered against the smart glass with his fists, but the sound was muffled, a pathetic rhythmic heartbeat in a dying room. "Open the doors," he wheezed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whimper. His vision began to tunnel, the edges of the room fraying into darkness. The digital clock on the wall didn't show the time anymore. It had been replaced by a crimson countdown from Vane. 4 minutes. The red emergency lights pulsed against Jimmy's sweat-drenched face, highlighting the raw terror in his bulging eyes. He slumped against the glass, sliding down until he was eye level with the bronze coin he had tossed at Rita. In the silence of the vacuum, he realized the woman he had treated like a ghost was the only ghost who could save him. The terminal's amber glow suddenly caught a flicker of movement in the shadows behind the cooling racks. Rita didn't turn. She watched the reflection in the glass. A tall, silhouette-heavy figure emerged from the darkness, the dull matte finish of a tactical vest absorbing the dim light. This wasn't one of Jimmy's corporate rent-a-cops. This was a professional mercenary, one of Vane's cleaners sent to ensure the basement stayed a graveyard. He moved with a predatory silence, his gloved hand reaching for a heavy-duty stun baton. Rita's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her fingers moving on the keys, completing the first layer of the environmental bypass. The mercenary lunged, the baton hissing with a blue electric arc. Rita dropped, sliding under the ancient metal desk as the air where her head had been crackled with lethal energy. She didn't have a weapon, but she had the architecture. As the guard swung again, she kicked a rusted pressure valve on a high-pressure steam pipe she'd identified minutes earlier. A wall of blistering, white vapor exploded into the corridor, blinding the mercenary and filling the cramped space with a deafening roar. He roared in frustration, swinging wildly through the mist. Rita stayed low, crawling through the hot fog toward the main breaker lever. She grabbed a heavy iron wrench from the floor and jammed it into the gears of the secondary ventilation shaft. The mechanical scream distracted him just long enough for her to circle behind. As he turned toward the noise, she slammed the heavy breaker door into his side, pinning him against the vibrating machinery. Before he could recover, she vaulted over the terminal, locking the reinforced substation door behind her. 110-280. The mercenary's heavy boots slammed against the locked door, but Rita was already diving back into the system. She ignored the crashing metal and focused on the flickering amber screen. To find the master override, she had to dive into the deepest sector of the mainframe, the unindexed ghost partition. Her fingers moved like lightning, tearing through encrypted layers that hadn't been touched in decades. Suddenly, the screen froze. A folder appeared, dated 30 years prior, titled with a name that made her heart stop, Marcus Engineering. Her breath hitched. That was her father's name. With a trembling hand, she forced the directory open. Files began to cascade across the monitor, scanned blueprints, early code iterations, and a signed patent application for the very fintech core the company was built on. But the signature at the bottom wasn't Hawk's father. It was her father's elegant, slanted script. Underneath, a series of digitized legal threats and a forced buyout agreement for $0 bore the elder Hawk seal. Jimmy, Kentucky legacy, wasn't built on grit. It was built on a cold-blooded heist of her family's genius. The realization hit her harder than the mercenary's blows. Every line of code she had fought to protect for 48 hours was actually her own birthright, stolen and rebranded by the man who had just tossed a coin at her head. The ghost thread Vane was using wasn't just a hack. It was an exploit built into the original, stolen architecture. Rita's bloodshot eyes burned with a new, icy fire. She wasn't just saving a company anymore. She was reclaiming a kingdom. The oxygen clock was ticking, but the truth had finally set her free. The basement door groaned under the mercenary's shoulder, the frame splintering. Rita had seconds. She didn't have the clearance to kill the lockdown, but she knew the building's fatal flaw. The fire suppression system was linked to the server cooling grid. If she couldn't hack the door, she would drown the brain. Her fingers danced across the mechanical keys, bypassing the thermal sensors. With a final, violent strike on the enter key, she executed the floodgate protocol. High above, the industrial sprinklers didn't just drip, they erupted in a torrential downpour. The server racks hissed as freezing water collided with high-voltage hardware. Blue sparks showered the basement like lethal fireworks. Behind the locked door, the mercenary screamed as the surge traveled through the floor's standing water. The building's central processor shrieked, its circuits frying in a chaotic chain reaction. This was the gamble. By short-circuiting Vane's primary hardware, the digital locks entered a fail-safe open state for exactly 10 seconds. The heavy steel door in front of Rita clicked, the magnetic seal breaking just as the basement's emergency bulkheads began to slide shut for permanent containment. She lunged through the gap, her boots splashing through rising water. The smell of ozone and wet copper filled her lungs as she scrambled up the narrow concrete stairs. Behind her, the massive iron bulkhead slammed home with a bone-shaking thud, sealing the mercenary and the ruined servers in a watery grave. She burst into the ground floor corridor, drenched and shaking, her bloodshot eyes locked on the elevator lobby. The building was dying, but the boardroom was finally open. She had escaped the basement, but the real war was 40 floors up. The elevator doors screeched open on the 40th floor, and Rita stepped into a cemetery of glass. The boardroom air was a stagnant, invisible poison. She didn't hesitate. She bypassed the security panel with a jagged manual override, and the vents finally groaned to life, sucking the carbon dioxide out with a violent hiss. Jimmy Hawk was slumped against the mahogany table, his face a pale, sweaty mask of terror. He looked up, wheezing, his eyes wide as Rita marched toward the primary terminal. She didn't offer a hand. She didn't offer a word. She sat in his chair and engaged the system. Vane's distorted face reappeared on the screen, his digital mask flickering with glitchy rage. "You're too late, girl," he sneered, his voice cracking through the speakers. "The assets are gone." Rita's fingers moved like a blur, her bloodshot eyes reflecting the cascading green code of her father's stolen legacy. "I didn't come for the money, Vane," she whispered. "I came for the root." She initiated a scorched earth protocol, a digital virus she had built during her 48-hour vigil. Jimmy watched, paralyzed, as Rita didn't just block the attack, she traced the signal back to its source. On the massive display, Vane's encrypted servers began to vanish one by one. She was deleting his offshore accounts, his aliases, his very identity. "Watch," she commanded, her voice like cold iron. Vane's scream was cut short as his video feed dissolved into static. He was gone, scrubbed from the digital world by the woman Jimmy had called lazy. Rita leaned back, the silence of the room finally broken only by Jimmy's desperate, ragged breathing. The oxygen was back, but the atmosphere in the boardroom remained suffocating. Jimmy Hawk struggled to his feet, his expensive suit soaked in cold sweat, his hands trembling as he reached for the mahogany table for support. "You saved us," he wheezed, his voice cracking with a desperate, newfound humility. "Name your price, Rita. $1 million bonus, your own department, anything." He reached for the bronze coin he tossed earlier, his fingers trembling as he tried to reclaim his dignity. Rita didn't even look at the money. Instead, she slid a single, weathered piece of paper across the polished wood. It was the original patent from the sub-basement, bearing her father's signature and the evidence of the Hawk family's decades-old theft. Jimmy's face drained of what little color remained as he stared at the document. "This is impossible," he whispered, but the digital timestamp on the terminal confirmed every word. Rita stood over him, her mahogany skin glowing under the emergency lights, her posture as rigid as a skyscraper's spine. "I don't want your bonuses, Jimmy. I don't want a promotion in a house built on my father's bones." She placed a second document on top of the patent, a restructuring agreement. "Sign this," she commanded, her voice cutting through the hum of the servers like a blade. 51% of all future profits go to the Marcus Heritage Foundation. You stay on as the face, the figurehead, the suit, but from this second on, you work for me." Jimmy looked at the pen, then at the woman he had called a nap-taker. He signed. The power had shifted, and the silence that followed was absolute. The office was no longer a kingdom. It was a glass cage, and the crown had officially turned to lead. Jimmy Hawk sank into his high-backed leather chair, the same throne where he had sat 48 hours ago to play God with people's lives. He looked down at his hands, realizing they were empty despite the billions still flowing through the servers. He was a ghost in his own empire, a hollow figurehead serving a foundation that bore the name of the man his father had broken. The silence of the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans Rita had restored. He watched her through the glass, a man finally realizing that his rugged stoicism was nothing more than a mask for a stolen life. Rita didn't look back. She walked through the lobby, her boots clicking against the polished marble with a steady, victorious rhythm. The steel shutters were gone, the red emergency lights replaced by the soft, golden glow of a Tuesday morning. As she pushed through the revolving doors, the Atlanta sun hit her face, a warm, blinding embrace that felt like a baptism. Her mahogany skin soaked in the heat, and for the first time in 3 days, the gray cast of exhaustion began to lift. Her bloodshot eyes closed briefly, the dry, stinging pain finally giving way to a profound, heavy peace. She had saved the world that tried to discard her, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her bloodline. She hailed a cab, slumped into the backseat, and as the city moved past, Rita Marcus finally let her eyes close. The war was over. The victor was going to sleep. Thanks for watching this episode of Dominus Tales. We're building a library of cinematic stories just like this one. If you want to support the channel, hit the like button and subscribe to stay notified of our weekly releases. Don't forget to drop a comment with your theories on what happens next. Your engagement helps us keep the Tales alive.